You just touched on it, Ken. How old is the Earth, and how are scientists so far off the truth?
Well, you don't dig up fossils or rock layers with labels on saying how old they are, right? We observe fossils, we observe rock layers, we observe the Earth, we can observe, certain of the universe and so on, and then man tries to interpret it in relation to the past. Ultimately, the only way you'd know how old the Earth was is if you were there at the beginning to see it start and record it all. Now, I would say God was there. He created it. And actually, if from a perspective of biblical authority, if you take God at his word in Genesis, he created everything in 6 days. Now, I know that there are many Christians that say we don't know what the word day means there in Genesis. It's interesting. They know what it means elsewhere in the Old Testament. As Genesis 1, they have a big problem. And the
Right.
reason is because they've been impacted by man's belief in millions of years. I challenge people, you don't get millions of years from the Bible. Ignore the outside influences if you take God's word as written. And we do know what the word day means in Genesis because it's a Hebrew word, the Hebrew word yom. And if you look up a Hebrew dictionary like Brown Driver Briggs or Kohler Baumgartner or one of those lexicons, you will find that the example given of when day means an ordinary day, because the word day can have a number of different meanings, that's true, but it's context that determines meaning. But when it has a context of being qualified by evening or morning or number or night, it means an ordinary day. And in Genesis chapter 1, we find that each of the 6 days of creation are qualified by evening, morning, and number. And so that alone says they were ordinary days. Exodus 20, verse 11, God made everything in 6 days and rested for one. Our 7-day week is based upon the creation week. That's what it's all about. And so if you start with those days as ordinary days, and Adam was made on day 6, he had a son, Seth, when he was 130 years old. And then it tells us when Seth had a son and so on. Those genealogies in the Old Testament tell you when people died and when they were born, that they're very specific. There are no gaps in those. And then you get to the time of Abraham, then you get from Abraham to Christ, and then from Christ to the present, it all adds up to about 6,000 years. So based on biblical authority, ignoring outside influences, only about 6,000 years. Sounds radical to a lot of people. It only sounds radical because we've been brainwashed to believe in millions of years. And so that's what I would take as a stand on the age of the Earth.
Yeah. So a lot of the way that scientists test today, sort of carbon data and that, how reliable are these things, Ken? Where are the mistakes happening?
A lot of people think carbon dating is a dating method that has to do with millions of years, but it doesn't. The half-life of radioactive carbon is only 5,730 years. And so after about 50 years, it'd be pretty hard to detect because, when you have a radioactive carbon-14, over time it decays, and the time it takes for half of that to decay is called the half-life. After 100,000 years, it will be non-detectable. Here's something we can say about carbon dating. If something is millions of years old, you will not get a carbon date. The trouble is, we get carbon dates for things that are supposedly millions of years old, such as diamonds or, coal or oil, and so it goes on. And so that means there's something wrong with the dates that have been given to these particular deposits. And we would say that most of your fossil record comes from the flood 4,300 years ago. And that's the same for most of our oil and our coal deposits would say come from the flood about 4,300 years ago, not millions of years ago. But all dating methods are based on assumptions about the past because something has to change with time. And you've got to know how fast it changes. You've got to know all the conditions of the past. You've got to know what was there to start with. I mean, there are a lot of assumptions that can be shown to be not valid at all. And there's lots of examples of that, and they can get that from our website at answersingenesis.org, because it would take, the rest of the interview to talk about all those issues that we have.
Yeah, yeah, great stuff.